All right, in today's lecture, we're going to talk about a few different things. We're going to talk about CSS, some advanced topics like pseudo-classes. That includes like hover state, active state, active state. There's visited state. There's different states that a CSS or an HTML element can be in. You can also grab specific elements based off of where they are in the DOM. So you can grab like the first paragraph tag or first paragraph element utilizing pseudo-classes. So you can target very specific elements instead of using classes and IDs. So we're going to cover some CSS advanced topics like pseudo-classes. We're going to talk about just some different displays in CSS using grid versus Flexbox. I'm going to show a couple examples using that. And then we're going to talk about the DOM or document object model, which is everything you see on the screen and how it's kind of architected. It's essentially the visual representation of the web page. And then we're going to talk about interacting with the web page using JavaScript, and also talk about local storage. So how we can actually store some data in the browser that persists even after the application is closed out or Chrome browser is closed out. So let's go ahead and get started. So in here, I've got an HTML file and a CSS file. I'm going to just go through some different pseudo classes, such as like hover, like active states. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to build up or code out the default HTML architecture using some shorthand, HTML. I'm can use this boilerplate one just because it gives me everything really quickly. So I've got the head, which is where all my metadata goes, and if I want to import style sheets, and then I've got my body, and I've also got the script tag here. I can include that script tag up here inside the head as well. This is where my JavaScript will go. So I've got this body. It's currently empty, so let's populate it with some HTML. So I just populated it real quick with a single parent div with several child H tags. So H1, H2, H3, very simple. And now in my style sheet, I'm going to import that into my index.html by running styles.css. It's the path to where my style sheets are. And if I list everything out here, my HTML and styles are in the same directory. So I'm going to list everything out, and I'm going to open the index.html in the current browser. And notice how they're all on individual lines, because H tags are all block level elements, so they all take up the entire length of the width of the web page. All right, so let's talk about let's give this, zoom in a little bit. Let's give this parent div a class of, say, like header container. And I can give this ID just like title. And these other ones, let's give it a class of subtitle or subtitles. Yeah, it's subtitle. And apply that class to the remaining elements. Cool. Now if I refresh, that's great. So now if I open up the inspector, I can see, let's zoom in there. I can see my body, it highlights everything. I can see the header container in each H1 tag, H2, and the subsequent tags. And I can see down here, the only styling that's applied is the very top level is HTML. It's a block level element. And so are all these divs, and you can kind of see the built-in styling of each element or each tag. Let's go ahead and look at some pseudo-classes. So a pseudo-class is essentially a specific state that you can target. Or let's look at pseudo-classes. So pseudo-classes is essentially added a special state of the selected element. So if I wanted to add a special state to the title, when I hover over it, I can target the title, ID of title, and say hover, and notice how it's automatically populates. And I want to maybe say like the background color to be red. So I click that and refresh it, and now it's not red, but when I hover over it, the entire background turns red. And maybe I want the cursor to be, full cursor grab. So I also want the cursor to change. So I'm going to zoom in. Zoom in there. Zoom out there once. So now notice how the pointer, the cursor changes to grab. Now, there we go. And maybe I also want to add another title or another pseudo class to title to that active. So active is when I'm actually interacting, like using a click. So if I click on it, that element becomes active. Background color, say maybe blue. And instead of grab, I'm going to say pointer, pointer. And I'm going to make the cursor grabbing. So when I click on it, so notice when I'm clicking it, it's actually changing state. And maybe I want the actual color of the text to turn to white. Okay. So those are different states, pseudo classes you can target. I can do those to all these other ones. So if I wanted like subtitle dot hover, and I want the background color to go like purple. So here I was targeting a very specific ID, so an individual element by its ID. These I'm targeting an entire class. So let's see what happens if I refresh. So now the entire class changes. So each element in the class has that hover pseudo class on it. So I'm going to color, I'm going to make that one white as well. Now you can see that. And also, what if I wanted to target the entire header container class? Container. And maybe say like active border say 4 pixels, solid, and turquoise. So when I click anywhere inside of there, so no matter where I'm inside of this container, if I click anywhere within it, it will add a border to it. Let's add a couple links somewhere. So if I want a div and an a tag, href, there we go. say like this is a link. Links have some very specific properties to it, or CSS styling to it by default. So if I hover over this, I can see that the link already has like the text decoration of underline. It automatically makes the cursor a pointer, and the color is this WebKit link, which is essentially like a purple. So I go back. So if I click on that, notice how active, when I click on it, it goes red. Maybe I don't want that to happen. And maybe I want the state of it to change after I click it. So I'm going to target this tag class equals, say, link. And I want to target that link. And instead of having underlined, I just want text decoration, none. What is it? There's like underline, there's some other stuff. So their underline is gone. Maybe I don't want the color to be purple. I just want it to be black initially, so I don't want it to actually look like a link. When I click on it, there we go. Let's go back. What if I click .link visited? So when I actually visit that link, I want the color to change to red. Let's see if this works. See, now it's already red because it already knows that I visited that link. So if I come down here, do a class unvisited link, I refresh it, oh, that one's already visited too. So if I link unvisited and say, dot unvisited visited, did I already visit that? Did I click on that one already? So let's say some link. Why is that changing? Why is that already red? Let's look that up. Pseudo-class visited. Visited pseudo-class. So visited suit represents links that the user has already visited for privacy reasons. These styles can be modified using the selector, are very limited. So color, hover, active, link. So these are the other pseudo classes. So let's see what this looks like. So link text decoration. Another link. I'm just gonna test link. I'm gonna create a class. Another link visited. Color blue. If I come over here, as long as it's already blue. What if I did another, but not visited, color black? And not working. Text decoration, none. Yeah, that's still blue for some reason. All right, I figured out why these aren't changing colors despite me not visiting those. So because they all link to the same route as backslash or forward slash, I've already visited this link, so all these other links say that I've visited to this specific route. So if I were to change this like this unvisited link. So link, so let's actually just delete this. And so this unvisited link, the class of some link, the color should be red after I visit it. Some link, color, let's say it's just black, background, color, let's see, goes with black, light blue, I don't know. And then after I visit it, let's make it different than this one. So another link, let's get rid of these right here. If I do dot some link dot visited, I want the color to be white and the background color to be black with a border of like 3 pixels, solid, and red after I visit it. So let's actually change this to some weird link, that I haven't visited yet. So if I refresh that, zoom in. So now notice how the unvisited link, the background color, the color is black and the background color is light blue. But when I click on it, now notice how it's the color is white, background color is blue, or background color is black. It doesn't have a border. Oh, well, that didn't work. But that's fine. So it's all right. It knows that I already visited that link here because it's already changed. And let's talk about another pseudo class called first child. So I want to grab, say, like the very first A tag. So I can say a.first child. I could say first child. So background color blue. So now that's the first child. So there's 2 A tags here. And I'm grabbing the very first A tag that's of a child, the child of a parent element. So this A tag is the very first child of this encapsulating parent div. You can even do multiple ones, like first child hover, background color blue. So now when I hover over that one, it's blue. So I can do that. Yeah, target, hover. Now background color is say like red. So you can combine pseudo classes together as well. There's a bunch of different pseudo classes. If you say Google like pseudo classes, CSS, W3 schools is a good one. You can see a bunch of different pseudo classes. You can say pseudo classes list. And here you can see pseudo classes as well. Hover, on focus, active, hover, current, pass, all these different pseudo classes. So that's a quick introduction to pseudo classes. All right, let's talk about grid and flexbox. These are the two, this is essentially how you are able to manipulate elements on the screen to place them in certain locations on the screen. There's 2 of them. There's grid, there's flexbox. There's a couple other ones, but generally speaking, grid and flexbox are the most common. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear this CSS, and I'm going to clear what's currently here inside of my HTML. The first thing I'm going to do, again, I'm just going to copy. I've got a div, a parent div, plus a bunch of different H tags, H1, H2, H3. And I'm going to go ahead and see what that looks like. If I refresh this, oh, let's get rid of that. There we go. So I've got my div, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use grid and randomize these H1 tags on the page inside of a grid. So a good resource is CSS Grid, and this CSS Tricks is a good resource on how to introduction to actual grid. So the first thing I'm going to do inside of my parent div is create a class. Let's call it grid. You can call this whatever you want. I'm just calling it grid because that's what this is going to be. So I'm going to call it grid. And in order to make a grid, I'm going to say display grid, not grid, grid. All right. And now I can actually tell the grid, I can say like how many columns and rows I want. So if you think of like grid paper, grid paper, grid paper. So it looks like you can actually make a grid like, all right, how many columns do I want and how many rows do I want? So for the grid, I want to say how many columns I want explicitly, as well as how wide I want those columns to be. So I can say grid template columns. And let's say I want how many different elements. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Say I want five columns, and say I want them to all be equal width. So I can explicitly say, hey, I want them all to be like 250 pixels and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm saying, hey, there's gonna be 5 columns and each column is gonna be 250 pixels wide. So if I refresh that, I see that each column is 250 pixels wide. If I hover over this, you can kind of see the actual grid layout with those little dotted border of each grid. But say I want them just to be evenly spaced all the way around, I can just say, hey, make it auto. So it's going to refresh it. Now it's auto-generated. So in the grid, it automatically kind of adjusts. Pretty cool. And you can, as you hover over the grid, you can see, again, that grid layout. But maybe I want to explicitly say, hey, maybe I want the second column to be 100 pixels wide. Maybe the third column will be 150 pixels. And yeah, I think that's good. So, and the other ones will the width will be auto-generated based off of the width. So for the ones I explicitly provided a value for. So again, this H2 one is 100 pixels and this H4 one is 150 pixels wide. So, and you can see that by hovering over that, clicking on that, and you can come down here and see the grid right here. And you can change this. This is a good place to change it. If I want to see what it looks like with 115 pixels wide for the second column, you can do so here. Cool. So that's one way we can do it. But now let's actually make a grid that has rows as well. So this is 1 row wide, or 1 row followed with 5 columns. Let's make some rows. So I'm going to say grid template rows. Let's create 3 rows of 100 pixels tall. Let's make this last one 150. So there we go. So now I've got a grid with 5 columns and 3 rows. And column 2 is 100 pixels wide, and column where the H2 tag is 100 pixels wide, and column 4 where H4 tag is 150 pixels wide. And you can see the rows are 100 pixels by 100 pixels, and the third row is 150 pixels. So let's actually make it a little more visible so you can actually kind of see all like I'm going to create a border around all the tags. So I could say like H1, H2, H3, H4, H5. I'm going to say border and border, say 2 pixels solid, and say blue. So there we go. And the reason why there's some padding, or yeah, some padding, I guess that's margin. So if you look here, compute layout, so there's a little bit of, there's no padding, but there's that orange part or tan part. That's all margin, and that's because they're H tags. So if these were just P tag, or I'm sorry, if they were just divs or P tags, actually I think, see if a P tag has margin. I think it does. So if I had a P tag as well, it would still have some margin. So if I made this H5 a P tag, if I so yeah, there's still some margin up there. Let's go back to H5. So let's move these elements around inside of this grid. So I can target first, make this H1 tag. I want it to start in this column and extend 1, 2, 3, so 0, so column 1, 2, 3, 4. So maybe I want it to extend this entire length. This so from column 2 to column 4, or I think it's these two. So if I want to target the H1 tag inside the grid, it's a grid. I can even just say H1, but I want to target that specific H1 tag inside the grid parent. So I'm going to say grid H1. I'm going to say grid column start. It's going to start at column 2, and it's going to grid column end at column 4. So if I refresh that, bang. So look, pretty pushed every other element to the side. So if you look, if I hover over it, start at column 2, 2, 3, 4. So it ended at 4, but not inclusive of 4. So it only spans 2 columns. Pretty interesting. So now, but it pushed all these other ones to the different, like made a wrap there. So let's actually make H2 start here, or H2, which is currently in column 4. Let's move it to the very first column. So I can target grid H2, and I'm gonna say grid column start 1. So let's refresh that. Whoop. So now it pushed it there. Grid column start. And maybe I also want, so it's starting in the first column, but it's on the second row, which I don't want. I want it to be in the first row. So just like I'm doing grid column start, I'm gonna do grid row start, and I want it to start at the very first row. There we go. So now H2, so I switched H2 and H1. So you can do all kinds of stuff with this. So you can span multiple columns. You can also span multiple rows. So for the H3, let's start it in column 3 and end in column 4, or 0, 1. So 0, or column 1, column 2 and 3. You can see 2 and 3, H1 is taking up 2 columns. H3 is 4, So maybe I want, so I want it to H3 to span columns 3 through 5, so the last two columns, as well as I want it to start down here in column or in row 3. So I'm going to move H3 and cover these two. So I'm going to say, hey, grid H3, let grid column start 3, grid column end at 6, because there's 5 columns wide, there's 5 columns, but I want it to go to the very end of column 5. So I'm going to say end at column 6, so it's not inclusive of column 6. And then I want grid row start row 3. So this is going to take up this entire, these 2 columns and be down here when I refresh it. Oh, okay, it started in column 3, that's what I wanted. So column 3, so it's taking up this entire element. So column 3, 4, 5. So H4, let's move that one to the very first column. I'm sorry, column 5, like right here, row 1. So let's span it in multiple rows now. Let's make H4 span row 1 and row 2, but stay. Yeah, let's move H4 to where H5 is currently at and span these 2 columns or these 2 rows. Let's say, hey, grid H4, grid column start. Let's start it at H5 or column 5. I don't need to do an ending grid, but let's do grid row start and start at row 1 and end at row 2, which would be end, like grid row end, which would actually be 3 because it's not inclusive of row 3, because we want to go row 1 and row 2, but not inclusive of 3. So let's end it at the very beginning of row 3. So there we go. So H4 switched with H5 right there, and it's taking up those 2 columns, or those 2 rows. And lastly, let's make H5, or we want to go H5. We can have it take up these 2 columns and these 2 rows. So grid H5, so grid column start 1, grid column end. It's ended at column 3, but so it's going to end right before column 3. So it's going to end right here. So it's going to be column 1 and column 2. Next, we can do grid row start row 2 and grid row end row 4. So if I refresh there, it's taking up that entire grid. So row 1 or row 2, row 3, column 1, column 2. Now you can also align these elements within the grid that it's taking up. So like H1, maybe I want to align it to the very end of this grid. So right here. So I can even go up to row 1, say like justify self. You can see all these different elements. So maybe the very end. So let's share how it aligned it to the very end of that. And H2, do align self, and say end. So align self, I think it's going to align it to the bottom. Yep, so aligned it to the very bottom of that element or that grid. Grid 5, so H5, let's center it. So justify self center. So now it's centered inside of that, these 4 grid portions. So that's a little bit about grid. You can vary, you can experiment with grid. It's pretty cool. Yeah. So let's do the same thing down here, but using Flexbox. So I'm gonna replicate this. Now you can't customize it as much as you are with grid by explicitly saying which element goes to which grid. The Flexbox makes things adjust and a little more responsive, and you can adjust rows, you can swap elements. So I'm gonna say flex right there. So let's refresh. Let's target all these. There we go. And maybe instead of having border or border solid blue, I want the flex container to have a solid like red or something. There we go. So this is grid and this is Flexbox. So down here, I'm gonna make this parent container. Again, CSS tricks, if you do complete guide to Flexbox, maybe, something like that. I don't know if that's CSS Flexbox, CSS Flexbox. There we go, CSS tricks. So in our container, we want to do display of flex. So the container of these H tags is flex. So I'm going to call it flex. Again, you can call this class whatever you want, just like flex container, whatever you want to call it. So I'm going to say display inline display flex. If I come back here, notice how flex container, there we go. There. So now they're all on the same line, but maybe I want them to be evenly spaced apart. So I can come over here. I can say flex direction. This is where right now it's defaulted to row. So flex direction is defaulted to row. So I'm going to say like flex direction. Maybe I want it to be stacked on top of each other, column. So now they're on a column. But maybe let's just keep that row. Again, the default value is row, so if you want it to be row, you don't need to include that. But maybe I want to reverse, instead of H1 starting, I want H5 to start. So I can say, hey, row reverse. So flex direction, row reverse, and now watch H1 and H5, that entire thing swap. So it's swapped, H5, and now everything's right aligned. So that's one way you can do it. You can do flex direction. Again, you can do column reverse. So instead of H1 being on top, H5 is not now on top. So that's one way you can do it, but say I want to evenly distribute those across. So I can say justify content is another tag. Let's say justify content. It takes in flex start. You can see what each child element does within there. So I can say flex start, flex end. If I do flex end, refresh it, everything goes to the end, but it still starts with H1. If I want it to be centered, you can center him. Centered, but typically, maybe I want everything to be spaced between, so as much space between everything. Space between, and now everything is spaced. There's like as much, starting at the very end of the parent element, starts like H5 and H1 are at the very end. If I did spaced evenly, this might, so now everything's evenly spaced with a little bit of padding or margin starting at the very end, at the beginning and end. Space evenly, what else? And space around. So you can see the differences between those values. So you can also align items, so you can target individual items. But let's see one thing. But as I close these, notice how the Flexbox, they don't wrap. Maybe I want them to wrap after I get to a specific width. So I'm making every single one of these H1 tags say like 200 pixels. And as I make them smaller, it doesn't stay true to like the 200 pixels. So if I go over a Flexbox, and I think we saw it up here, flex wrap, we can actually wrap the items. So flex wrap, want it to wrap. So 200 pixels, so there we go. And as it gets smaller, it makes it a little more responsive. It wraps them, so it maintains the 200 pixels width. There we go. So it's a little responsive, there you go. Those are the main things with Flexbox. You can also like center stuff. So if you come down here, you can align items within like individual items. So center, so align items, you can say like center. Now everything's centered vertically, which is nice. But yeah, those are a bunch of different ways how to use Flexbox and Grid. All right, let's keep on going and talk about the DOM, or what is called the document object model. The document object model is essentially the browser's visual representation of everything that's on the web page. So think of it as a big tree data structure. So if you open up the console, if you type in document, you can see how everything is highlighted, and you can open everything up and you can see this is the document. And every single element you see on here is a node in the object model. Let's get rid of that, let's get rid of that, let's get rid of that. So if you want to see something here, this is kind of like a visual representation. So the document, and then there's the root element, which is the HTML tag. Then each one of these elements are also referred to as nodes on the tree or on the document object model. And you can grab any element, you can interact with that element anywhere. So if I type in like GitHub, and if I opened up, or let's do something different. Let's do just say stripe.com. Stripe might not be a good example, but if I type in document, so I can see like what this is called. It has a class, overlay. So here's a good example. So here has a class of copy body. I can directly grab that element. So I can say like document dot get element by class name. Copy underscore, is it body? Underscore body. So you can see I grab everything from the document object model, every single node that has, or every single element that has a class name of copy body. And you can see an HTML collection was returned, and there's 18 of them. So you can kind of see where else they might exist. Let's say I wanted to only grab the first one, so I could up let first equals, this returns an array, so I'm going to grab that first one. Cool. So now if I type in first, there you go. This is a node on the DOM. Now I can actually change first.inner text, and I can see what that inner text looks like right there. I can even change the inner text. First.inner text equals, this is me changing content on the web page. Notice how it says this is me changing content on the web page now. This is how we can use JavaScript to interact with the DOM. You can grab specific elements by using document.get element by class name. I can even say like first.add event listener, click, and then write a function that might change first.inner text equals I clicked this DOM element. All right, so when I click on this, okay, it says I clicked this DOM element. So I can interact with the DOM using JavaScript. Just know that the DOM is referred to as document object model, and how the browser parses all the different elements on the web page. And you can access everything using the document keyword, and you can see all the different clear document. You can kind of see the entire document from here. You can kind of see like how to list all methods on document or on DOM. So if you can list them all, I'm sure there's a way you can list them all. Init values. But document. Oh yeah, so you can see all the different ways you can grab all this stuff. Document actions. Just looking right here. See document.location. Now you can see the actual location of where I'm at. So I'm at stripe.com, path name right there. Path name is what comes afterwards. So if I click on products, payments, I go to payments, I can say like document location href. Now I can see that. I can also just say the path to that path. And now I'm going to / payments or / payments. So that's the DOM. All right. Now let's talk about storage and storage things, or not just interacting with the DOM using JavaScript, which we've done before. Open. HTML. So yeah, let's start talking about interacting with the DOM using JavaScript, as well as storing things locally inside of the web browser. So in our game, number guessing game, so I'm just going to bring that up real quick. So here's my number guessing game. I'm going to open index.html, and here's my number guessing game. I'm going to open up the console, and you can see inside my JavaScript here, right there, is and my HTML. So I've got my title, let's say like number guessing game, like so. And we're going to refresh. So it says number guessing game. And let's just make sure everything still works. So I can say like 50. Pick a higher number, 75. Pick a higher number, 87. Cool, I won, yay. So that's all using JavaScript. Here, let's see. So hello, November Platoon. So I've got pick numbers right there. So I've got a random number of 0. So pick random number is a function down here that says just picks a random number, console logs it, and it returns random number. So it assigns a random number to this random number variable. And then I've got get element by ID, submit button, on click. I'm adding an on click event handler to that. So you can add an on click event handler by doing like an event listener on click, or just doing .click, adding that attribute to it. When that runs, it executes this function. It gets the element by ID by the input number, that value, it assigns it to a variable called number. Right there, I'm console logging the type of. I'm saying, hey, does number.length equal 0? If I don't type in anything, it issues an alert. I can show that by refreshing there, clicking there, and an alert page comes up. And now here I'm saying document.create an element, create a list element, assign it to a variable called node. I'm saying, hey, assign the inner HTML to that node to that number. So it's going to display that number on that list. Now I'm saying also document.get element by ID, the number list, which is an ordered list or unordered list right here. So it's an ordered list, it's an empty list, and I'm appending that list node to this OL, this ordered list. So every time I enter it, it's going to add a list element there and my guess number, some like 50 or something like that. That's what that line is doing right here. That's what this chunk of code is doing. Then it returns check number, returns this function check number, which comes into here, checks the number. This is where the logic is, hey, whether I guessed higher, guessed lower, whether I guessed the correct number. But now I want to know if this user, if the first time a user comes here, I want it to say like, hello, like player, please enter your username. So I'm going to just up at the very top, say, what should it say? hello, or let's see, maybe I just want H1, hello, is, yeah, let's say, let's actually do a welcome. Welcome to the number guessing game. And also, let's do an input here. Let's see what the input looks like. Input type text. Yeah, there we go. Let's do a placeholder. Say username. And let's make an ID of username. Or username. So if I come here, and also I guess let's make a button. So if a user has never come here, a user can enter their username. Submit username. Cool. So what I want to do is when a user comes here, welcome to the number guessing game. If this is the very first time they've ever visited here, I want them to be able to type in their name, submit their username, and then every other time they come here, it'll say like welcome and then their username. So what I can do is write some logic. So it says document.get element by ID, and I'm getting the element by ID of submit username, submit username. I'm going to add an on-click event handler to it, on-click, and it's going to execute a function that's going to grab the value from this input. So ID of username. So console log, I'm sure do console log, document dot get element by ID, username, and I want to grab that value. So if I refresh, saying like Tom, submit, I get Tom here. So I want to store this somewhere in the web browser. And I can do that in what is called local storage. I click local storage. This is storage that is local to the web browser. And local storage, it's every web page you visit, pretty much the application is storing information about you inside of local storage. So look, I'm here in GitHub, I'm going to local storage, and this is everything about GitHub that's storing information about me. If I go to REPL it, so notice how I go to REPL it and I'm already logged in. It knows that because it's either storing stuff in cookies or local storage, and it knows that I'm already logged in. So if I, somewhere in here is probably find like a username or something, not username, but like there's some identifying information. So AJS group ID, maybe that's it. Here's my anonymous ID. Maybe it's taking this and sending it back to the database, it's checking some value in the database, saying, hey, this person's already logged in, and it's automatically logging me in. So local storage is how I can store stuff. But this web page right here, there's nothing stored in here. So I want to store this get element, this name that I'm inside of local storage. So I can do that by doing local storage dot set item, and local storage is think of it as an object where the values can only be strings. So I'm going to set item, say like username. So there's going to be think of it as an object username inside of local storage, because you can kind of see how it's an object. If you look at here, it's an object, but notice how the value is a string. However, the value here, it looks like an object with type, left size. These are the key values. However, it's stored as a string. So you have to like parse, if you want to store a value as an object or an array, you have to store it as a string and then undo that to like an actual JavaScript object. So let's just show here, local storage dot set item. I'm going to say like username, and then say like some user name. And now if I go to local storage, notice how I've got username, some username. And now I can grab that item by saying get item, and then grab that username value or the username key. So get item that belongs to the username key. It's called some username. You can also clear local storage, which is always nice to do, clear. And now if I go to local storage again, it's empty. So I'm going to do that in here as well. So local storage set item username, and I'm going to set it to this value. Cool. So now if I refresh this, I'm going to check local storage. It's empty. I'm going to say username Tom, submit username. And now if I go to local storage, now I've got a local storage of username of Tom. But I want this to change. After I submit my username, I want it to change. It says like welcome and then my username. So after I submit that, I can do some logic that can check whether or not there's a username stored in local storage. So I'm going to say let check username equals if local storage dot get item username exists, I can change this h1 tag. I can say like ID of welcome. So I can say document dot get element by ID, the welcome ID dot inner text equals, I can do like welcome local storage. So I'm doing welcome, and then whatever that username is. Let's actually break this off. I'm going to put this into its own variable. Let username equals, there we go. And so it just says welcome username. Let's check it now. So I can say Tom, didn't do anything yet. Why didn't it do anything? Oh, because I'm not calling check username. So I can say return check username, like so. If I click that, welcome Tom, it's great. But now I want this submit button to also disappear. So I can also remove this input as well as this button. So I can say, I can actually wrap this in a div and just remove that entire div. ID, submit, username, container. So I can say document, or I can return document.getElementById, submit username container. I can do dot remove off of that, and it's going to remove this entire piece of HTML. So if I refresh that, Tom, welcome, Tom. But when I refresh it, it's not reading whether or not this username exists. So this check username, I can just invoke at the very bottom right here. So every time the page loads, it runs through this function. Hey, if the username exists in local storage, set it there. So if I refresh that, so now you can kind of see it go there. So now every time I refresh, it just says welcome, Tom. Now if I want to clear local storage or check local storage, there's my username. I can do localstorage.clear. It clears local storage. I check local storage again. There's nothing in it. If I refresh it, now it says welcome to the number guessing game because it's checking in local storage and there isn't an existing user there. If I do, let's say Tom, welcome, Tom. And now if I just keep refreshing, it knows I've been here. And I can even go a step further and see how many games I've played. So I can store like how many games I've played in local storage. So I can say like local storage dot set item games played. And the initial value is like 0. And now I can say like local storage games played is 0. But again, I'll have to store this as a string as well if I wanted to. So it's got games played on local storage and username. So if I play a game, I can do some logic that also stores this into local storage. And with that, you can pretty much develop applications such as, to-do list, just pretty much anything. But think about like how to convert number, or I would say object from local storage, JavaScript. So here's storing objects. So we've got these things called JSON stringify and JSON parse. So that's how you can parse like string objects from local storage and parse them and convert them into JavaScript objects, and vice versa. You can store JavaScript objects as like stringify them, as they say, or parse them back into JavaScript objects. And that is local storage.